We're in 2 Samuel 21. Now, 2 Samuel 21 is the beginning of kind of an ending section of really this whole combined book of Samuel. You will remember that the chronology has sometimes been loose because many things have been arranged thematically or to tell a particular story, to group like events together. History books do that sometimes, particularly ancient history books, that they're not always in order because the goal is not always to say this happened and then this happened and then this happened. Here instead we have things arranged a little bit differently. So chapter 21 has some assorted events in it from different times in David's life. You should not necessarily read this as just having happened after everything we just read about with Absalom's rebellion and with the other rebellion that happened, Sheba's rebellion. But instead, these are things that happened at different points. Basically, what the author of Samuel is doing is fleshing out some additional details to help further paint the picture of who is David as a king, how does he react to different situations, what kind of success did he have. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these wars, because this is kind of the last bit of information that we really get about David's reign. We'll see his conversation with Solomon as you go into Kings, but really for David's reign, this is about it in these last few chapters that we have. And of course, there's much more that hasn't even been said. But out of everything that has been said, the author of Samuel wants you to ask, what kind of king was David? As the one who is called God's anointed, as the one who replaced Saul as being a failure of being God's anointed, what kind of king is David? Does he fulfill what God wants the anointed to fulfill? On one hand, the answer to that is going to be yes, he fulfills it. And yes, he is the best king that Israel is ever going to have until Jesus comes. Everything is measured against him. He is the benchmark. He is the one that they're going to compare the kings against for generations to come. On the other hand, I think we've seen already enough failures on David's part that it's pretty clear that he's not perfect. And it's pretty clear, but it's not just, that one time that he messed up with Bathsheba, right? There's more going on than that, showing David's imperfections and flaws, that leaves that lingering question, can Israel do better than David? The way the rest of the history is going to play out in the Old Testament is, no, Israel cannot do better. But, of course, when Jesus comes, that will be how Israel does better and the world it does better. So that brings us to chapter 21. And we are first going to look at a famine that Israel experienced for 3 years. We do not know when this famine took place. Again, breaking the chronology, it could have been at any point. There's some reason to think that maybe it was a little bit early on, but we don't really know. So you can throw out any time you like, and I'll tell you that that's possible. So why did Israel experience a famine for 3 years? Okay.
Because Saul and his family tried to kill off the Gibeonites.
Okay. So, yeah, Saul has this blood guilt for killing the Gibeonites, trying to kill them all. Evidently killed some, but not all of them. And this famine is God's judgment of the matter. Now, I do find it mildly interesting that the famine goes on for 3 years, and the only record we have of David asking God what's going on is after it's been happening for 3 years. I don't know if that implies that he wasn't asking God before that. It's quite possible that God was not yet ready to answer David and that there was going to be some judgment on Israel first before an opportunity for them to fix it. But it also could be that David just accepted it as a fact of life, and then realizing that it's not going away, then asks God, basically, what gives? Why are we doing this famine year after year? Why is this not going away? Dave?
Well, I think it's important to remember that a couple things in my perspective is that David didn't see everything. Oh, that's what God said. You don't imagine family.
Sure.
We might not even put two and two together yet.
Yeah.
Certainly getting to the first 2 years.
Yeah.
That's very possible that we just didn't think about it being other than family, just natural family.
Yeah. Yeah, to give David as much benefit of the doubt as possible, I would, kind of think along those lines that maybe David was assuming a natural occurrence and just praying to God normally about it, please end this famine and, guide us. But maybe 1 and 2 year famines aren't that uncommon, that they do happen. And it's as it stretches into that 3rd year that David starts thinking, this is bigger than normal. We're speculating a little bit, but regardless, the point of this is that at some point David realizes that he needs to go to God about this much more specifically and ask, why is this famine happening? Is this a judgment from God? Because that's the idea that he's getting, and he is actually right. Okay? Okay? Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, under the law of Moses, when they did what was right, it was left.
Yeah.
So if they're not being blessed, there's something wrong.
And that does, yeah, I mean, and there still were, natural disasters that happened, and they could use the preparation and the good judgment from before to be able to weather things like that, just like storms hit and fires happened and all of those things. But yes, this idea of it stretching longer, getting into 3 years, certainly leads us down that road of God is not blessing Israel. There seems to be a curse happening here, a judgment happening here. What's going on? And David does the right thing to inquire of God and to ask what is happening. And God's answer to him is that Saul has this blood guilt, and God needs something to be righted before this famine can go away. Yeah.
But then they made a league with them, and then, it was like, well, they promised that they wouldn't kill them. So now they're all trying to kill them. And I thought we should have killed them before.
Yeah.
God holds them responsible for that promise
Yeah.
that they made.
Right. Okay, so that is a very interesting discussion. And that's a discussion that we had when we studied Joshua, because that whole story is a little difficult for us. How is it, and Jeff's alluding to it here, but how is it that Israel made this covenant, made this pact with the Gibeonites? Sue? Yeah. And God was not pleased with that. That was an avoidable situation. But now they have sworn an oath to them and made a covenant with them. And when we discussed this in a Joshua class, we talked about how this is a difficult situation now. That you have two competing things. That one, they were supposed to wipe these Gibeonites out. And then now they've also sworn and invoked God's name that they're going to keep the Gibeonites alive. And so there doesn't seem to be a very good solution here. You can come up with a lot of rationales going both directions and say, well, the covenant is void because they tricked us. Or you could say, well, you didn't seek God, and so you're responsible for the covenant that you made without him. Or God's initial command overrides anything that they came up with afterwards. Or, to invoke God's name and to make a covenant then is going to bring greater harm to God's name if you then break it. So there's a lot of back and forth in trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. Clearly, God's judgment of the matter is, in this situation, his will has now changed. You're going to keep the Gibeonites alive. This is a little different than some of the other groups of people who the Israelites did not finish conquering and left some among them that in years to come, they went, David and others went in and fought them some more until they defeated them, until they subjugated them or destroyed them. Think of some of these other groups of people that were not finished off in Joshua, but could be later. That was different, apparently, than the situation with the Gibeonites. And we can know that because God has made his judgment clear. Why Saul decides to go and attack the Gibeonites is an interesting question. He has not necessarily been very faithful and very enthusiastic about going and finishing the job that was not yet completed in Joshua. We know that Saul's military campaigns were for the most part limited to protecting Israel from their greatest threats or dealing with the Philistines in particular because they were the big ones to worry about. So anyone have any ideas as to why Saul might have fought against the Gibeonites? There may be a geographic reason for it. Again, this is kind of some level of speculation because we actually don't have this event recorded for us. We read about Saul's blood guilt, but there's no cross-reference here. In the whole time that we read about Saul, it did not discuss him going and fighting against the Gibeonites. The only reason that we might be able to conclude that Saul did this is that the Gibeonites lived close by to where Saul's capital was. Saul had his capital city of Gibeah. The Gibeonites are close to Gibeah and are in mostly the land of Benjamin there, where Saul is based. And so he might feel particularly threatened by having these people nearby. If it's not that, I don't know what it was. It wasn't God telling him to do it. So one way or another, he was motivated to deal with these people, to go and attack them, even though he had a lot of other threats. We don't know exactly why that could be. Dave? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Jeff? Right.
That made Saul, the Israelites, guilty. I think if the
Right. Yeah, there's no indication that they broke that. Essentially what God has done here is he's upgraded the Gibeonites from the status of their judgment must be complete and total up to the status of the other people around who the Israelites were only allowed to fight if they resisted them. You remember that from Joshua and from Deuteronomy? That there were some peoples that if they don't put up a fight, if they let you go through, then let that happen. Don't worry about them. They're not your main targets. But these other people who are inside the promised land, who are inside these borders that I am giving to you, you need to go and destroy them. Because of Israel's foolish vow, God has essentially upgraded these Gibeonites, giving them some more mercy than they deserve, but this is God's right to do that. God gets to make the decisions on how people will be judged and what he's going to do with them, and God has judged in this situation that it is better for the Gibeonites to have that extra bit of mercy so that the Israelites do not break their vow than it is for the Israelites to go along with the initial command that God gave them and break the vow and drag God's name through the mud, through the mud that way. This weather is destroying me here. Sorry. So that's God's judgment on the matter. And you look at that and you might have questions about that. You might think that seems strange, and I'll remind you, God is the one who gets to make those judgments. He's the one who has the final say in all of that. And clearly he expected them to know that his will was now for the Gibeonites not to be harmed. But there is this blood guilt instead. I'm going to grab my water. A moment. Okay, so that's who the Gibeonites are. And again, we don't know when all this happened, but now it's David's problem. So David goes to the Gibeonites in verse 3, and he says, "What shall I do for you, and how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" What do the Gibeonites ask for to atone for the harm that's done to them? 7 sons of Saul. Okay, so they don't want money. They don't want indiscriminate killing or war, which lends nicely to Jeff's point. The Gibeonites are not looking for conflict with Israel. If they did, this would be grounds for them to start that. They could say, Israel started it first. let's go, let's fight. They don't have any interest in fighting. They don't want that. They want this problem to go away, and the way to atone for it is for 7 sons of Saul to be given over to them and hanged. Now, David agrees to this. He finds 7, and of course when we say sons, we mean that slightly more generically than the way we would use sons. Male descendants is a pretty appropriate definition of that for their time and their place, and not quite as specific as we would make it. And so David chooses 2 sons of Rizpah, and Rizpah is one of Saul's concubines, so those would be 2 of his literal sons. And then 5 sons of, depending on your translation, either Merab or Michal. And of course, Merab and Michal are Saul's daughters, and so 5 of one of their sons would be Saul's grandchildren. No problem with it being Saul's grandchildren. That would be what they expect. The point is taking away people from Saul's house, taking away male descendants to strip this house of power, of people to carry on in the next generation. That's exactly what the Gibeonites are looking for. Let's talk, though, about... Oh, sorry, Dave, you had a comment? Oh, okay. Very good. Let's talk about who this is. The Rizpah part's easy. There's no conflict there. When I am reading from the ESV in verse 8, It says, the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. There we go. So mine says Merab. Yours might say Michael, depending on what translation that you are reading from. And in reality, both of those could be it. It's a little bit complicated here, so I'll give you a little textual background. The majority Hebrew text says Michael. Michael being the same Michael who David married. She was the daughter of Saul. David married her, was given her because he killed Goliath, and they were married for a time. She had been given over to someone else, and then when David left, but then David gets her back when he comes into power, and then Michael is bitter about David making a fool of himself when he is celebrating and dancing when the Ark of the Covenant is brought back in. And so they have some bitterness between them. And the last thing that we read about her in 2 Samuel 6:23 is that she did not have any children until the day she died. And that's really the end of what we hear about Michael. So the majority Hebrew text does put Michael in here. And then the New King James and King James follow along with that, and probably some other translations as well. If this is Michael, we do immediately have a problem, because this is said that she has 5 sons. And 2 Samuel 6:23 says that she did not have any children until the day she died. Also, it says that she bore these sons to Adriel, the son of Barzillai. We know that Adriel, the son of Barzillai, was married to Merab, not to Michael. So that seems to be incorrect. It is possible that what happened is that Merab married Adriel. Sorry, losing my names. Merab married Adriel, had 5 sons, and then she died. And then Michael stepped in and married Adriel and kind of raised those 5 children as her own, but did not actually give birth to them. And so some of the translations, when it says in verse 8, whom she bore to Adriel, some of the translations say whom she brought up with Adriel, which is an acceptable translation of that same Hebrew word. It can be used both ways. So it's possible that that's what's happening. The other possibility is that it's not supposed to be Michael here at all. It's supposed to be Merab in the first place, and that we have some sort of corruption of the text, and those majority Hebrew texts are all kind of following the same corruption. So the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Septuagint has Merab there. And so the ESV and New American Standard and NIV and CSB and some others follow the Septuagint there and say, but it's Merab. And so the point there would be that Merab's 5 sons are taken and killed for the Gibeonites. I just wanted to point that out to you. I don't necessarily have like a resolution to that because it's just one of those textual debates. Either way, I don't think we need to be worried about there being a conflict with 2 Samuel 6:23 in saying that Michael never had any children until she died. That can very easily be explained by her marrying her late sister's husband, which, if you're familiar with Hebrew custom, that's something that often did happen. That when a spouse died, particularly early, that often you have that sibling, that brother or sister, whatever's relevant there, step in if they are unmarried and fill that role. The slight bit of complication with that is Michael was David's wife, and we don't necessarily see that David sends her away He might have, and even if he did, would he have allowed her to just marry someone else when she had been the king's wife? That is unclear. The details are not given to us. But both ways, you got to do just a little bit of work with it. Ida?
But at some point, he had gone and married
Did she? Am I forgetting that?
remember that when he was
Yeah. Right. Yes. Okay. Correct. Yes. She was married to someone else for a time because when David was on the run, Saul took Michal, kind of away from David. David had to leave, gave her to someone else. That was right. Paltiel, not Adriel for sure. Yeah. So there's that situation. But by the time that David comes back, he takes Michal back, much to Paltiel's dismay there. He doesn't want that to happen. And so then after their argument in 2 Samuel 6, does David send Michal away? I don't think it says explicitly that he does. It's possible, but we don't know for sure. Did she end up marrying her late sister's husband? Maybe. Or is it instead a corruption in the text and we're talking about Merib the whole time? Maybe. Either way, the main point of this is Saul's house takes another hit. That Saul's house is going to decline some more, and they've got more of these male descendants who are being killed. Did you have more to say about that, Mark?
Just backing up, he did it for the zeal of the Israelites in the area. He was influenced by them somehow, whether it was glory or whether they wanted the land, so they asked him to do like the land. So, yeah, that's my understanding. And this whole thing about the whole Michael part of it is
Yeah,
a little complicated.
it is a little
Hard
complicated.
to know, but I think the point is,
Yeah.
yes, the fact that Michael didn't have any children should have been contextual and not David.
Right.
And anything else is possible.
Yeah. The only I don't always like to bring stuff up like that because it's a lot of times not super relevant. The reason why it's good to bring some of these up is sometimes people point at these as contradictions and say, look, the Bible is wrong because it can't even keep its story straight. Michal didn't have children and then she did have 5 children, and what's the deal? The point being is even if there are some things that are a little confusing where we're not quite sure which way the answer is, they're both easily explainable. Scribal errors do happen. Very easy to mix up Merib's name with Michal's name and for that to somehow get kind of carried across. We do see that in other manuscripts. But also very easy for Michal to have stepped in when Merib died, if that's what happened. And so both of those are quite reasonable and nothing that we really need to worry about. Jeff?
There was human citizenship,
Right.
right? There's one betrayers, one killed.
Yes. So good point there. We did see in verse 8 that one of these sons of Rizpah was named Mephibosheth and was given over. But then specifically, we know that David spared Mephibosheth, verse 7. The Mephibosheth that we've been talking about this whole time, who's the son of Jonathan, right? This is a different Mephibosheth, just a shared family name for 2 different people. David specifically spares Mephibosheth because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan specifically. That he was going to protect his family. So David could have used that as an opportunity to kill off Mephibosheth, but he doesn't want to do that. So he's going to maintain his oath in a way that Saul did not maintain the oath of the Israelites. Okay? So what did Rizpah do after her sons were killed? So they've, in the style of how these people would be executed, they're hanged and their bodies are left there to, as a warning to other people, but also to be denied a proper burial. And that was a very dishonorable thing to the Israelites, to really all of the ancient cultures of that day in that area, for you to not have a proper burial, for you especially to not get to be buried with your family, in your family tomb. Something's gone really wrong. Either you are so destitute that you can't do that, your family's so destitute, or you are a dishonorable person and nobody wants to give you an honorable burial. And so for covenant breakers, that's kind of a situation that nobody's going to go to the trouble of burying you and be seen giving you honor when you don't deserve honor. And so their bodies are left there hanging. And what's going to happen with corpses that are rotting out there in the open? You're going to have scavengers come along. You're going to have birds and animals who see that as an opportunity for a meal, as gruesome as that is. Well, to a mother, that's horrifying. And she doesn't care one whit about taking on any dishonor. She's already been dishonored for her sons being very publicly executed in this way. She's concerned about trying to stop the curse that has been put upon them from having its full effect. She doesn't want their bodies to just be picked clean. And so she goes and she takes sackcloth and she puts it over their bodies. She's trying to prevent the birds and the animals from picking those carcasses clean. But there's not a whole lot she can do. She doesn't take the bodies and go bury them for reasons that must have been logistical, right? How can she get the bodies to the tomb? Is anyone going to let her do that? We don't see like a great solution for her here. We don't see her trying to dig graves for them right there, though she may have ended up doing that. She's just kind of in a state of desperation and trying to protect the bodies of her sons and maybe the bodies of the other family members as well. She could be doing this for all 7. She might have some reason to do that. So yeah, how is she going to transport 7 bodies by herself when she can't leave them here unattended, or the animals will get to them? Even if it's only 2, how is she going to do that? Jeff? Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could be, yeah. That's probably the most reasonable way to read it. And she's got adult children, for sure. So, she's not young. That is pretty clear. What is she supposed to do about this? There's not a great solution for her. And in fact, it's not really resolved here. We don't get a real solution for Rizpah and for her sons and for the other 5 as well. But this is something that spurs David on to think about something else. David hears about what Rizpah is doing, and what does he decide to do with the bones of Saul and Jonathan as a result? Dave. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sorry, I misspoke slightly there. That there is a solution here for her, not that Rizpah is able to come up with herself, but of course David is going to step in and going to create some opportunity there for her. That yes, David sends people to to go and to gather those bodies and to give them a good burial. But also, not just with them, but this has gotten David thinking about the bones of Saul and Jonathan. And we remember there were some shenanigans with the bodies of Saul and Jonathan before, that they had been stolen. David goes and retrieves those, with the point being that for all of these, descendants of Saul and even Saul himself, David is going to give them a proper burial in the family tomb to restore some shred of honor to Saul's house. And in fact, we see David do things like that multiple times, that he has achieved total victory over Saul's house, and he could have destroyed them into obscurity, where he kills everyone who's even remotely connected to Saul's house, denies them proper burial, and everything like that. But actually, at multiple turns, David uses his power, uses his influence to be able to restore a little bit of honor back. Mephibosheth getting some of those lands back. How many kings would give a family member of the previous regime land and power? That's, maybe not tons of power, but certainly a fair amount of land there. That is kind of an amazing thing for David to do. And the house of Saul then gets a little bit of honor back. Being able to be buried in a family tomb, a little bit of honor back. David has respect for the concept of the Lord's anointed for that office, even if Saul did not use it very well. And so then by extension, he's going to give some honor to the rest of Saul's family as well. Jeff? Yeah.
David was not just another person that came in, and defeated Israel. It wasn't a battle. Saul was his enemy.
Yeah.
David had respect for God.
Yeah.
So, Saul was not David's enemy. David was Saul's enemy, but it wasn't the other way.
Right.
David did not want to fight Saul.
Right. That's very consistent all throughout David's interactions with Saul. When he has very little power and is on the run, and then is still true when he has power and he's king. He's not looking to completely destroy Saul's house. He's accepted that God has judged against the house of Saul and has put him in power. He's not going to abdicate the throne and give it to one of Saul's descendants or anything like that. But he also doesn't need to, grind them into the dirt any more than God is going to do. That's very consistent from David. Betty? Yeah. Yeah, and there are, this is something that we see in that culture. Sometimes, breaking a covenant, a crime against someone breaking a covenant could bring consequences even to that house and that family. You're responsible for the honor of everyone in your family. And so that's why there was such strong pressure for you to not discredit and dishonor your family, your tribe, your nation, all of that. We don't necessarily think the same way about it, but Saul has blood guilt against him, and the justice cannot be meted out against Saul because he's dead. Something has to be done. God's solution has been to bring famine to the whole land. And David would like for that not to happen. And so then the solution instead is that these 7 male descendants of Saul, are going to be killed. And that's, it's possible for them to be executed for the dishonor of their house without, being personally guilty. But the price is going to be paid for these Gibeonites who have been killed. Yeah. 7 is very, yeah. Right. Yeah. There is some symbolism there of, we'll accept that as sufficient, as complete in righting this wrong. Okay, so the last section of this chapter is some assorted events from wars of the Philistines. And these are just very brief records of different battles that happened. Again, they're not all the same battle. They're not all at the same time. They're at different points. It's just a scattershot of 4 battles that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, except there is something in common. What do these 4 events have in common? Aaron? Great, yeah, okay. So some great champion, specifically said to be a descendant of a giant himself, is present at each one of these, killed at each one of these. This is pretty common for like military records of the time. Some of the commentators say that maybe this is like taken directly from military records because the details are pretty like short and to the point here. As there was this battle and Israel won, and this is the one who slayed the great giant. It's very important. This is very much like Goliath, and that's not an accident. Go ahead, Jeff. You might be saying what I'm about to say. I'll let you do it.
Well, I said this before, but it was the story of David and Goliath, 5 stones.
Yeah.
I think David was ready to take on Goliath.
Yeah.
All 5 of them. I think he was prepared to do that. We know that the rest of the Philistines fled. David didn't have to fight the other 4 brothers. But he got 4 brothers. I think that's the reason why the Bible doesn't just throw out random words and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It specifically said he took up 5 stones.
Yeah. And when you mentioned that when we were there before, that was new to me then. And when I looked into it then, and as I've looked into it more coming up on this too, like I'm on board with you. I think that's right. That these are the brothers of Goliath, and that David was prepared to fight all of them. That you've got 5 brothers who are all great champions, who are all giants. Of course, David only ends up needing to fight one of them at that moment, but he doesn't know that. They very easily could come and attack David afterwards. That's kind of against the spirit of what that one-on-one combat was supposed to be, but are you going to trust the Philistines to keep that promise? They very well might not. So, yeah, David has shown that faith, being willing to fight against the whole family of Goliath if necessary. It is not necessary right then, but it will happen eventually because all of these giants are in future battles. And David does not kill any of the others. It ends up being other people. He is involved with one of them, specifically in verse 16, talking about, verse 15 even, that they're fighting and David grew weary. It seems like he's in some danger. Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. And it seems like he was probably going to be successful because David is tired and weak here. Verse 17, but Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. And this evidently was a very close call because David's men said, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle lest you quench the lamp of Israel." This was too close. You can't die. If Abishai dies, it's a problem, but they'll move past it. If Joab dies even, it's a problem, but they'll move past it. If David dies, the lamp of Israel goes out. Right, so you've got that one. You have the others as well. Saph, who's killed by Sibbecai. And then here it says Goliath again. That's probably, if you compare with 1 Chronicles 20 and verse 5, it's probably supposed to be brother of Goliath. That's probably a corruption there. I feel pretty good about that one. That this is probably Lami. You got the connection. Read 1 Chronicles 20, and you'll see that. And so if that's supposed to be brother of Goliath, then that would explain that. And then you have an unnamed giant who's got 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand. and in each foot, and was killed by Jonathan, but not that Jonathan, David's nephew. And all of these were great victories under David's rule, that they're slaying all these champions, all these giants who literally tower over the Israelites. Yet with God, the Israelites are successful, and David has brought them to great victory. Okay. Next week, we'll get into 22. We've got the Song of David coming up. This should be good discussion. We'll look forward to that next week. Thanks.